HOA burned down my cabin resort after I said no, then went pale when I pulled their budget. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Acrid, biting, sharp enough to slice through sleep like a blade. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, still half tangled in a fog of restless nightmares. But then came the sound. A crack, a pop, and then a roar, like an angry ocean wave breaking against a cliff. My eyes flew open. The glow outside my window wasn't dawn. It was fire. I stumbled out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor, and ripped open the curtains. What I saw made my throat lock tight. My cabin resort. The dream I had built board by board, lodge by lodge, for 12 backbreaking years, was a furnace. Orange flames licked up the walls of the nearest lodge, leaping higher than the pine trees that surrounded the property. Smoke twisted into the black sky like a serpent, blotting out the stars. Embers drifted in the wind, falling across the roofs of other cabins like sparks on dry tinder. The fire was spreading fast. Too fast. I tore through the cabin, grabbing the phone. My hands shook as I dialed 911, my voice breaking when I gave the address. They said trucks were on the way. I hung up, but I knew, deep down, that it would be too late by the time they arrived. Outside, the heat slammed into me like a wall. It was suffocating, blistering, a living thing. The resin-rich pine wood cabins, built to be rustic and beautiful, were turning against me now. I had spent years sanding those beams smooth, staining them with care, proud of their golden sheen. Now they hissed and cracked as fire devoured them, each one exploding in showers of sparks. I tried to run toward the nearest lodge, Cabin 6, where a family had stayed just last week. My feet sank into the pine needles scattered across the ground, the air thick with ash. But before I got close, the porch roof caved in, collapsing with a groan that sounded almost human. I staggered back, shielding my face. There was no saving them. None of them. By the time the first fire engine roared up the gravel road, the resort was already lost. Firefighters in heavy gear shouted orders, unwinding hoses, the water arcing uselessly against walls that collapsed moments later. The air was filled with the shrieks of wood splitting and the dull crash of chimneys falling. I stood among the neighbors who had gathered, their faces lit by the flickering inferno. Some whispered about faulty wiring. Others muttered about lightning, even though the skies had been clear for days. One man speculated about vandals, kids from town maybe, setting fire for the thrill of it. I said nothing, because I remembered. I remembered the meeting last week in the community hall, the long oak table, the smell of stale coffee. I remember the HOA board members, all smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They had leaned in close, their voices low and smooth, but sharp enough to cut. "Sell it to us," one of them had said, "or you'll regret it." At the time, I had laughed it off. I told them the resort wasn't for sale. Not now, not ever. It was my life's work. They had smirked, whispered among themselves, and left. And now here I was, watching my dream burn to ash. No one else knew about that meeting. Not the firefighters, not the neighbors, not even the sheriff who arrived later, his hands on his hips, shaking his head at the destruction. To them, it was just a tragedy, a disaster, bad luck. But I knew better. As I stood there, the heat baking my skin, I felt something deep in my chest. It wasn't just grief. It wasn't just rage. It was a vow, quiet, cold, and sharp as broken glass. They thought they had taken everything from me. They had no idea what I still had left. And they had no idea what I was going to do. Gerald showed up the next afternoon, right as the last fire truck pulled away and left the property in smoldering silence. He wore a navy blazer that was too clean, too pressed for someone who claimed to be rushing from a meeting. His shoes shone, and his aftershave carried the faint scent of cedar. I hated that detail, that he would come to my ashes smelling like pine. He shook his head slowly as though rehearsed, lips pursed in pity. "My God, I'm so sorry, son," he said, his voice dipped in honey. "Such a tragedy. But these things happen. Insurance will cover you. You'll bounce back." His hand patted my shoulder with the weight of counterfeit sympathy. But his eyes, those gray, calculating eyes, betrayed something else. A quiet satisfaction, maybe. A certainty. I muttered thanks, though bile rose in my throat. My gaze lingered on the board members behind him, 3 of them clustered like vultures. Each had an alibi already rehearsed, I later discovered. One had been out of town, his hotel receipts already printed and folded neatly in his pocket, as though waiting for someone to question him. Another had been photographed at a charity gala, the pictures conveniently time-stamped and splashed across social media. A third had signed purchase orders at the hardware store exactly when the fire broke out, receipts tucked away like medals. It was all too neat, too airtight. Tragedy usually left loose ends, jagged edges. But this smelled of polish, of planning. That night, when the neighbors went home and the fire crews left, I stayed behind. I sat in the ruins of my office cabin, the night wind carrying the bitter stench of wet ash and charred pine. My hands trembled as I sifted through the rubble, fingers blackened, nails splitting on shards of wood. That's when I found it. Beneath the collapsed beam where my desk once stood, half buried in soot, lay a warped hunk of metal and paper, the melted corner of my ledger. Most of it had burned, the ink dissolved into black smudges. But in the corner, a miracle remained. Faint but legible numbers, half burned but still fighting to be seen. Not just any numbers. Their numbers. Columns I had kept on community dues, invoices, quiet transfers that didn't match the official reports the HOA filed each year. The very ledger Gerald once asked me to leave to the accountants. My heart pounded. They hadn't known I kept a second copy, hidden in my desk. They thought the fire erased everything. But the flames had failed. And sitting there in the ashes, with that charred fragment glowing faintly under the moonlight, I understood something. They hadn't only given themselves alibis. They had given me a weapon they didn't yet know had survived. The diner was the kind of place where secrets didn't last longer than a cup of coffee. A single glance was enough to set tongues moving, and I felt them all on me that morning. Eyes darting from behind menus, coffee cups raised just high enough to shield lips curling in speculation. I sat in my usual booth near the window, the one where I could watch Main Street's slow crawl of pickups and logging trucks. But today, the view outside didn't matter. The real storm was inside. Maybe he said it himself. A woman whispered behind me, her voice pitched just loud enough to be overheard. The kind of whisper meant to be a dagger, not a secret. Another voice, male, came from across the counter. Insurance fraud. Happens all the time. Man builds big, realizes it's more than he can handle. Then oops, fire. A ripple of low laughter followed. It wasn't cruel outright, but it was knowing. That was worse. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the dark swirl of cream. My face betrayed nothing. I didn't defend myself, didn't turn around to confront them. I let their words wash over me like rain on stone. The waitress, Ellie, set down my plate, 2 eggs, bacon toast. She gave me a sympathetic look, but even sympathy carried weight here. It meant she believed the fire wasn't my fault, but that she still had doubts. Everyone did. Rough week, huh? She murmured. I nodded once. Something like that. No more. The less I said, the better. Because silence, in a place like this, was a disguise. The quieter I stayed, the less they suspected I was already pulling strings behind the scenes. They thought I was broken, gutted, humiliated. They thought I was a man cornered. But cornered men don't sit quietly and lick wounds. They sharpen knives. As I finished my breakfast, I let my eyes sweep the diner once. At the far table, Gerald's cousin sat with 2 other HOA loyalists, pretending not to notice me. Their voices dipped whenever I came near, their laughter swelling the moment I passed. Good. Let them think I was cowed. Let them believe their fire had ended me. But here's the thing about fire. It is only destruction for those with nothing left to burn. For me, the fire was cover. The cabins might be gone, but the ashes hid more than they destroyed. The ledger fragment in my pocket was proof. Proof of rot. Proof of theft. Proof that the HOA had secrets darker than flames. And if whispers in the diner spread fast, whispers in the town council spread faster. I sipped the last of my coffee, left a tip, and walked out into the sharp morning air. Behind me, the whispers rose again. Words like smoke, clinging, choking, staining the air with suspicion. But I didn't look back. They weren't vultures. Not yet. There were only crows, circling overhead, waiting for me to fall. And I had no intention of falling. I didn't rebuild the cabins. Not yet. Instead, I rebuilt my war. The hammer and nail stayed locked in the shed, useless now. My tools became a laptop, stacks of county records, public ledgers smudged with fingerprints of 1,000 bureaucrats. By day, I haunted the courthouse, requesting filings that clerks retrieved reluctantly, as though each page carried poison. By night, I spread them across my kitchen table, paper curling in the glow of a single desk lamp. Coffee stained the margins. My pen dug furrows into pages where I circled figures again and again, whispering the numbers to myself like incantations. Something was wrong. The HOA wasn't just corrupt. Corruption was too small a word. They were siphoning blood out of the town itself, and no one had noticed. Maintenance funds, money collected to repave cracked sidewalks, to repair lampposts, to keep the lake clean, vanished into accounts with names like North Pine Solutions and Greenway Services. Shell companies, incorporated quietly in states 2,000 miles away. Emergency funds, set aside for natural disasters, had been drained twice in the last 3 years. But no storm had ever hit us, no flood, no fire, until mine. And then I found it. Hidden deep in a maze of expenditures, camouflaged in bureaucratic gray, was a series of payments labeled simply as consulting. The amounts were too clean, too rounded, as though calculated for convenience rather than truth. And the dates. My breath froze when I saw them. One payment, transferred at 11:48 p.m., the very night the flames first lit the sky above my cabins. Another, 3 days earlier, to the same account. A third, a week before the fire, labeled operational retainer. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred, my reflection staring back in the glass of the monitor, pale and hollow-eyed. They hadn't just set the fire. They had paid for it with money stolen from their own neighbors. I leaned back, the chair creaking under me. My hand shook, but not from fear. From rage. Cold, surgical rage. Gerald had sat across from me, days after the blaze, his voice dripping with honey, telling me insurance would cover it, telling me these things happen. But these things didn't just happen. They were orchestrated, funded, signed off in neat digital ink. And now I had the trail. I called the meeting under the pretense of surrender. A man crushed, finally willing to let go. That's how I packaged it, wrapped in false defeat, tied with a bow of desperation. Gerald took the bait. The HOA board gathered in the community hall, the same long oak table where they had once threatened me with soft smiles. Tonight, the air smelled faintly of varnish and coffee, and the overhead lights hummed as though buzzing in conspiracy. They came in dressed like victors, pressed jackets, polished shoes, expensive watches that winked under the fluorescence. Men who thought they had already won the war and were now simply signing the peace treaty. I arrived in plain clothes, faded flannel, worn boots, the costume of defeat. My shoulders slumped, my eyes weary. I wanted them to believe the fire had broken me, that I was here not as an equal, but as a beggar. When I mentioned I was considering selling the resort land, they laughed. Not polite chuckles, but the unrestrained cackles of men drunk on their own power. Gerald leaned back in his chair, hands folded over his stomach, smugness carved into every line of his face. Well, he drawled, voice rich with mock sympathy. Looks like tragedy breeds wisdom after all. The others joined in. One of them muttered, "Should have done this before the fire," and the room erupted in laughter again. I smiled faintly, nodded, play my part, because what they didn't know was that every word, every laugh, every lie was being recorded. Hidden microphones nestled in my jacket buttons, a discreet pen clipped to my shirt pocket, transmitting every sound to a secure cloud server. And the documents I had collected, the tax filings, the shell company records, the consulting payments tied to the fire, were already copied onto encrypted drives. Not just one, several, in the hands of people outside this room. People who had no love for Gerald's board. Insurance brokers. Former HOA members. A journalist who owed me a favor. If they silenced me tonight, Their empire would still crumble tomorrow. I waited until the laughter ebbed. Then I leaned forward, elbows on the table, and asked a simple question. What about the fire prevention expenses? The words dropped like stones into still water. Gerald froze. His mask cracked, just for a second. His fingers twitched against the polished wood of the table. His gaze flicked toward one of the board members before snapping back to me. That flinch was worth more than a confession. It was instinct, unguarded truth. And I saw it. I locked it away. The rope was tightening. Slowly, carefully, invisibly. They thought they had me cornered. But in truth, they were the ones choking, their own alibis coiling around their throats like nooses. I leaned back, feigning ignorance, letting the question dissolve into nervous chuckles and Gerald's quick deflection. Accounting oversight, he said too fast. Happens all the time. But his eyes betrayed him. And I knew then, as I sat in that room surrounded by men who believed themselves untouchable, that their kingdom of polished smiles and forged receipts was nothing but tinder. And I was the spark. The town hall buzzed with low voices, the kind of restless hum that fills a room when people expect bad news. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of neighbors, taxpayers, shop owners. They had all come to watch me finally bow my head, to witness the last gasp of a man ruined. Whispers rippled as I walked in carrying a battered cardboard box. Some pitied me. Others smirked, already writing the story in their heads. He'll declare bankruptcy, maybe beg for donations, maybe move away in shame. Gerald sat at the front table with the rest of the HOA board. His suit was immaculate, his tie knotted like a weapon. He leaned back, legs crossed, a smile tugging the corners of his mouth. His eyes glittered with victory. I placed the box on the desk beside the projector. My hands moved slowly, deliberately, like a man who has nothing left to lose. Thank you for coming. I began, my voice steady. I know many of you expect me to ask for help or money. But tonight isn't about my loss. Tonight is about ours. Murmurs flickered through the room. Gerald's smile deepened. He thought I was unraveling. I pulled the first folder from the box and slid it beneath the projector lens. The screen behind me lit up, bathing the room in pale light. Numbers appeared, rows of figures, familiar to anyone who had ever glanced at a community budget. This, I said, tapping the page, is your money. Your dues. The funds meant for sidewalks, for street lamps, for fire prevention. The audience shifted uneasily. I clicked to the next page. The same funds, now draining into a company no one recognized. Greenway Services. Shell company, I explained. Registered in Delaware. Owned by no one you know. But money flowed there every year. A low murmur ran through the crowd. Next slide. North Pine Solutions. Same story. Funds drained. No services rendered. Then came the hammer. A page marked emergency preparedness drill. Scheduled, I said, my voice sharpening, for the night of the fire. The room gasped. Conversations erupted. Someone shouted, "You're kidding." Another hissed. I knew it. Gerald's smile died. His face went stiff, pale creeping up his neck. His hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Line by line, I exposed it all. Fabricated repairs, padded invoices, money vanishing into holes that led straight back to them. Every lie was now light on a wall, undeniable. By the time I reached the consulting payments, time-stamped to the exact night flames devoured my cabins, the room was boiling with outrage. People stood from their chairs, voices raised, demanding explanations. The board sat frozen, caught in the blaze of their own making. Gerald's lips moved, a whisper carried to no one but me. "How did you?" I turned to him, a smile touching my mouth. "You burned my resort," I said, voice low but carrying. "But you also lit up your books." The crowd roared. The town square had never been so silent. The sheriff's deputies moved in with calm precision, the heavy thud of their boots echoing off the walls as they crossed the hall. For a moment, the HOA board still clung to their illusions of control. Gerald, the self-appointed president, adjusted his suit jacket as though that thin fabric could shield him from what was coming. Margaret, who once sneered at me during every HOA meeting, tightened her pearls around her neck as though strangling herself with pride. Others glanced nervously at the crowd, trying to measure whether the neighbors who once whispered behind their backs might now spit in their faces. Then the handcuffs came out. The metallic click carried through the air like a final gavel. Gerald's face drained of blood as his wrists were bound in steel. Margaret cried out, swearing it was all a misunderstanding, that she had never signed those checks personally, her shrill voice breaking into a desperate wail. Another board member collapsed into his chair, shaking his head, whispering the same words over and over. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. But it had. The neighbors, those who had rolled their eyes when I warned them, those who had muttered that I was paranoid, stood frozen. Some looked ashamed, unable to meet my eyes. Others were wide-eyed with shock, their mouths open as if they had just watched the earth split beneath their feet. And in that silence, I felt something shift. The years of doubt, the dismissals, the laughter at my expense gone. Now they stared at me not as a man broken by loss, but as someone who had dragged truth into the daylight. The sheriff gave me a nod as his deputies began escorting the board members out the back door. Gerald resisted for a brief moment, jerking his arm and hissing, "You'll regret this. You don't know who you're messing with." I stepped closer, my voice low, steady, cutting. "No, Gerald. It's you who didn't know who you were messing with." For the first time in years, he didn't have a comeback. His eyes darted away, the way a wolf's eyes lose their shine once the pack abandons him. When the police cars pulled away, red and blue lights flashing against the night, the crowd began to stir. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into conversations. Some neighbors came to me with tentative steps, offering apologies in hushed tones. A woman who had once testified at an HOA meeting that my resort was a liability reached out and touched my arm. Her hand trembled as she said, "I'm sorry. We should have listened." I nodded, but I didn't answer. Forgiveness, I realized, was not something I could hand out like flyers. It had to be earned, and time would tell whether these neighbors had truly changed or were simply adjusting their loyalties to whichever side seemed safest. The next blow came quickly, faster than even I expected. The insurance company, armed with the budget documents I had exposed, launched their own investigation. Within days, they issued a statement. The HOA's claims were fraudulent, the payout frozen, their liability shifted back onto them. The empire of intimidation, built on threats, lies, and backroom deals, cracked apart in a single week. Those who had relied on HOA funds for their personal luxuries suddenly faced foreclosure notices. The town gossip mill roared to life, shredding their reputations with the same cruelty they had once reserved for others. Gerald's smug family was seen packing boxes late at night, avoiding eye contact with anyone on the street. Margaret's perfect lawn, once the pride of the neighborhood, grew patchy and wild as unpaid fines stacked against her. And me? I returned to the charred remains of my resort. The cabins were gone, reduced to blackened timbers and piles of ash. The smell of smoke still clung to the earth even after the rains. But as I walked through the ruins, I realized I felt lighter. Not because the pain of loss was gone. It wasn't, but because the shadow that had loomed over me for so long was finally lifting. The fire they had started had destroyed my business, my livelihood, the place where families once came to laugh around campfires and watch the sun rise over the water. But it had also burned away their power. Their empire was ashes too, and unlike mine, theirs could never be rebuilt. Neighbors began approaching me, not as skeptics, but as volunteers. One by one, they asked if I needed help. Some brought tools. Others brought money. A few just brought their presence, standing quietly with me among the ruins, letting me know that silence didn't mean indifference anymore. I didn't know yet what I would build in place of the resort. Maybe new cabins. Maybe something different entirely. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wouldn't rebuild under their shadow. I wouldn't let my future be chained to their lies. As I stood on the cracked foundation of the main lodge, watching the sheriff's car disappear down the highway with the HOA board inside, I finally drew a deep, steady breath. Sometimes you don't rebuild what was lost. Sometimes you build something new, stronger, cleaner, untouchable, on the ruins of their lies. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready. The report came quicker than I ever thought possible. Just 5 days after the fire, the sheriff knocked on my door at dawn. His boots scraped against the wood of my porch, still dusted with ash carried on the wind. He held a manila folder thick with photographs, chemical analyses, and receipts that weren't supposed to exist. "Mr. Lane," he said, his voice low, "you were right. This wasn't lightning. This wasn't negligence. It was deliberate." I took the folder with shaking hands. Inside were photographs of the blackened ruins, zoomed in on streaks of unnatural residue on the beams that hadn't been entirely consumed. The laboratory analysis listed names I knew from my days as a builder: xylene, heptane, methyl ethyl ketone. Accelerants. None of them had any reason to be anywhere near my cabins. But what made my throat tighten was the last section of the report. Invoices. Gerald's company, Green Vista Maintenance, had purchased the very same chemicals under a different label: landscaping supplies. Bulk orders, signed with his initials. Delivered just 2 weeks before the fire. The sheriff's eyes softened. "We've got enough to move forward. I'll be forwarding this to the DA's office." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The proof I had been praying for lay in my hands, but instead of triumph, I felt the weight of finality. The cabins weren't coming back. Not like they were. The town turns. News spreads in a small town the way smoke spreads in still air. Slow at first, then suffocating. At the diner, where I used to sit alone while whispers floated behind my back about that fool who thought he could outsmart the HOA, the tone shifted. Now, voices lowered not in scorn, but in guilt. "Did you hear? Gerald bought the chemicals himself. Always thought he was too slick. My cousin's boy played on his lawn. Never liked the way he smiled. The people who once crossed the street to avoid me now crossed the street to avoid him. Gerald, who had strutted into every Sunday service as if he owned not just property, but morality itself, found pews emptying around him. Parents who once encouraged their kids to mow his lawn or shovel his snow now tugged their children away when he waved. And Gerald noticed. I saw in his posture. He still wore the expensive suits, still slicked back his hair with that glassy arrogance, but the smirk was gone. The corners of his mouth twitched now, as if he were constantly chewing on fear. He walked faster, shoulders tight, eyes scanning to see who whispered behind him. Respect was a currency, and Gerald's bank was running dry. The HOA scrambles. The HOA board called an emergency meeting in their usual smug tone, as if authority alone could erase evidence. I attended, not as a member, but as a ghost, silent, watchful, recording once more. They shuffled papers, speaking in half-sentences. There must be some mistake. Receipts can be fabricated. The sheriff is under political pressure. But the cracks showed. 2 members avoided Gerald's eyes entirely, sliding their chairs subtly away from him as though betrayal might be contagious. One board member muttered something about liability insurance before being shushed. Gerald pounded the table. "We stick together. If one of us goes down, we all go down." The room went silent. That was the first time the truth was spoken out loud. Their empire wasn't built on bylaws or budgets. It was built on shared dirt, shared guilt, and now shared panic. Investigators in the ashes. 2 weeks after the fire, I returned to the ruins with the investigators. The ground was still unstable. Some beams still smoldered when kicked. The lead investigator, a woman named Clara Jennings, crouched near what had been cabin 4. "You see this pattern?" she asked, pointing at the blackened wood that looked almost feathered at the edges. "That's poor pattern. Someone poured accelerant in a line here, then lit it. Classic arson signature." I swallowed. Cabin 4 had been where families stayed, where laughter used to echo through the thin walls. Now the same space held the mark of deliberate destruction, as if someone had dragged a pen dipped in fire across the floor. Clara stood, brushing soot from her knees. "Mr. Lane, you should prepare yourself. This won't just be criminal. It'll be civil. With the documentation you've given us, financials, recordings, invoices, they'll face lawsuits, and you'll likely be called as the star witness." Star witness. The phrase chilled me. I never wanted to be in a spotlight again. And yet, justice required a voice. Mine. Gerald's mask cracks. The first time I saw Gerald after the report went public, he was standing in front of the courthouse. Cameras snapped, microphones shoved forward. He raised his hands as if calming children. These are baseless accusations, he declared. A smear campaign orchestrated by a bitter man who couldn't handle responsibility. For a moment, the old Gerald flickered alive, the man who could twist a room with a single phrase. But then, a voice from the crowd cut through. My brother lost his job because of you. Others joined. You lied to us. You burned him out. What kind of man destroys another's home? The cameras caught his face as he faltered. His smirk twitched, then dropped. The sweat under his collar showed. Gerald had always fed off applause. Now the crowd gave him only stones. Courtroom fires. The courtroom was colder than the ashes of my cabins. Fluorescent lights buzzed. The judge, an older man with patient eyes, presided with silence that cut sharper than anger. The DA laid out the evidence. Chemical traces, purchase orders, meeting transcripts I had provided where Gerald laughed off safety inspections. Then my recordings played. Gerald's voice, smug, echoing across the room. We'll do what we have to. The cabins are a liability. If fire comes, well, insurance pays. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even the stenographer paused for a breath before resuming. Gerald's lawyer objected, shouted about out of context, but the damage was done. Truth, once set free, is fire that doesn't extinguish. The ashes speak. On the night before the verdict, I drove back to the ruins alone. The moonlight painted the skeletal beams silver. I sat on what had once been the front porch of the main lodge, now just a blackened platform. For the first time, the smell of smoke was gone. What remained was silence, a heavy, listening silence. I closed my eyes. Memories came not as sharp stabs, but as soft waves. Children roasting marshmallows. Couples holding hands by the fire pit. The laughter of strangers who had become family under my roofs. I whispered into the stillness. You'll rise again, but on my terms this time. The ruins didn't answer, but I felt it. Somewhere between grief and resolve, that ashes don't lie. They carry truth in their silence. The verdict. When the verdict came, the gavel struck like thunder. Guilty. Fraud. Conspiracy. Arson. Gerald's empire crumbled in a single word. The HOA board members scattered like rats, some making deals, others vanishing from town altogether. But me? I walked out of the courtroom not with victory, but with a blueprint. The cabins would return. Different, stronger, untouchable. The community would not just stay in them, but help build them brick by brick, memory by memory. Because fire had stolen wood and nails. But it had also burned illusions, masks, and false power. And ashes don't lie. The gavel came down in the county courthouse, and the sound still echoed in my ears weeks later. The homeowners association that once prided itself on being the moral backbone of our little mountain town had been gutted, stripped of power, dismantled piece by piece, not by force of nature or a stroke of luck, but by truth, paper trails, and their own arrogance. The sheriff's report, the receipts, the testimony of neighbors who could no longer stand the weight of silence. Together, they formed a noose that tightened around the HOA board until they couldn't breathe. Gerald, their silver-tongued leader, was left clinging to his lies like a drowning man clutching at driftwood. By the time the dust settled, fines, lawsuits, and pending criminal charges had bled the HOA dry. The very organization that once sent letters threatening fines over grass length and porch paint now had their assets frozen. Their empire, cabins, lakeside parcels, luxury vacation homes they once used as bargaining chips, went up for public auction. That was my moment. I walked into the auction hall in silence, wearing a suit I hadn't touched since my wedding day. My boots still carried the faint scent of ash, but I wore them anyway. Let them smell where I'd come from. Let them remember. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the dusty hall. Lot 1, Lakeside Cabin, formerly held under HOA management. Opening bid. I raised my hand. Others raised theirs too, but their numbers fell short. One by one, The cabins that were once stripped from families for missed dues, the homes Gerald flaunted in his exclusive retreats, were falling back into my hands. Sold, sold, sold. By the end, I owned them all. Every splinter, every rusted nail, every memory that HOA had stolen. Even Gerald's prized vacation home, the one he called his castle on the lake. I paid pennies for it. Pennies for the kingdom he had lorded over others with. And the irony? The money I used to rebuild was money reclaimed from them. The settlement funds, the damages awarded when the courts recognized the fire for what it was, arson born of greed and hatred. The same HOA that tried to bury me had unknowingly financed my return. Construction began in the spring. The air still smelled faintly of smoke where my cabins had once stood, but now the earth trembled with the sound of hammers, saws, and laughter. The townsfolk who once crossed the street to avoid me now came offering their hands, their tools, their sweat. Farmers, carpenters, even teenagers on summer break. People showed up at dawn, asking, "Where do you need us?" I didn't just rebuild cabins. I built something different. Where the HOA once demanded conformity, same siding, same colors, same stiff rules, my sanctuary was built on freedom. Each cabin carried its own soul. Some were painted bright, others muted, some wrapped in reclaimed wood that still carried scars of fire. I let families choose. This place isn't about control, I told them one evening as we stood around the foundation of the first finished lodge. It's about belonging. No board. No HOA letters. Just life. Word spread. By summer's end, bookings poured in. Families who'd been priced out of the old resort came back. Travelers found refuge by the lake. And slowly my land, our land, breathed again. Gerald couldn't avoid me forever. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast the lake in gold, I heard the sputter of an engine behind me. A rusted sedan rolled past the edge of the construction site. At first, I didn't recognize it. The Gerald I remembered never drove anything less than a polished truck, always gleaming, always spotless. But the man behind the wheel now, his hair had thinned, his shirt clung with sweat. His eyes, those same eyes that once burned with smug authority, flicked away the moment they landed on me. He slowed the car, just enough to look. I stood there in my boots, arms folded, the skeleton of a new cabin rising behind me. He couldn't bear it. He pressed the gas, the engine coughing, and drove off without a word. For years, Gerald had driven past my cabins with his head high, his smile smug. Now it was my turn to watch him lower his eyes. He had burned down my life. I had burned down his legacy, and the town knew it. Children no longer waved when he passed. Shopkeepers stopped greeting him. Even his old allies on the HOA board avoided his calls. He was a relic of rot in a town that had decided to grow clean again. But here's the truth most people didn't see. Rebuilding wasn't just about cabins. It was about me. The fire had taken more than wood and stone. It had taken nights of sleep, pieces of my sanity, my faith in people. When I stood in the ashes months ago and whispered, "You'll rise again," I didn't just mean the resort. I meant myself. And rise I did, brick by brick, nail by nail. Ashes don't lie. They tell the truth of what was destroyed and what can never be destroyed again. By the time the first guests arrived in the new cabins, the town was buzzing with a question that spread like wildfire through diners, grocery aisles, and church steps. Did you hear? He built it back. Better. Stronger. Without them. And when people asked me what I was calling the new place, I only smiled. The sanctuary. Because that's what it was. A place free of the HOA's chokehold. A place born from ruin, carved out of betrayal, and forged in fire. And as I watched the cabins glow under the sunset that first night, I realized something Gerald would never understand. You can burn down wood. You can burn down walls. But you can't burn down a man who refuses to bow. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and disinfectant. The kind of mix that made you feel both out of place and strangely reverent. I had been inside many official buildings in my life, but this day carried a weight unlike any other. Months of waiting, rebuilding, fighting, all leading here. The hall outside the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters adjusted their microphones, shuffling through notes. Locals from the town, many of whom had watched the HOAs rise and fall with wide eyes, sat shoulder to shoulder on the benches. Some were survivors of the HOA's arrogance, small business owners strangled by their petty rules, families fined for the height of their fences, retirees bullied for daring to paint their porches a color not pre-approved. But most of all, they had come to see Gerald. When the guards finally brought him in, the chatter died. Gerald Kavanaugh, the once proud president of the HOA, looked nothing like the man who had stood so smugly in front of me months before, telling me that my resort was a threat, that I had lost my say in the community I built with my own hands. Gone was the tailored suit, the Rolex, the smug grin. What shuffled into the courtroom that morning was a man stripped bare of his armor. His cheap, crumpled suit looked borrowed, his wrists shackled, his hair gray and greasy, his once commanding frame now slouched. He had been living on county food and sleepless nights in a cell. For a moment, his eyes flicked toward me, a desperate attempt at reclaiming control. But I met his gaze head-on, unflinching. He was the one chained, not me. He looked away first. The charges. The judge, a stern woman with sharp glasses perched low on her nose, called the court to order. Papers rustled, chains clinked, and the bailiff's voice boomed. The people versus Gerald Kavanaugh, Leonard Briggs, and members of the Lakeshore Homeowners Association. One by one, the charges were read aloud. Arson, fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, abuse of power. The list seemed endless. Every word felt like a nail hammered into the coffin they had built for themselves. Each charge wasn't just legal terminology. It was a chapter of what they had done to me, to the town, to anyone who stood in their way. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman who had made a career of dismantling corrupt networks, laid out the case with ruthless precision. She displayed photos of my resort reduced to charred rubble, financial records showing HOA dues siphoned into Gerald's private accounts, testimonies from residents who described being threatened, fined, and extorted. The walls themselves seemed to echo with condemnation. And then came the footage. Someone in the crowd gasped when the grainy security video was played. Gerald and his cronies sneaking near my cabins, gasoline cans glinting under the moonlight, flames erupting moments later. Gerald flinched when the screen caught him clearly, face illuminated by the fire he thought would erase me. He had burned down my dream, but in doing so, he had recorded his own destruction. Gerald speaks. When it was his turn to speak, Gerald tried to summon the voice that once commanded HOA meetings and struck fear into neighbors. His words trembled instead. This has all been exaggerated. I was protecting the community. He was building without proper permits, without oversight. The cabins, The judge cut him off sharply. Mr. Kavanaugh, this is not a homeowners meeting. You will address the facts, not your fantasies of authority. A few muffled chuckles rose from the crowd. Gerald's face flushed red. He looked around, realizing there was no respect left for him in this room, only contempt. When Leonard Briggs, his treasurer, tried to speak, he broke down mid-sentence. Tears streamed as he begged for leniency, throwing Gerald under the bus, swearing he was just following orders. For the first time, Gerald sat silent, powerless. My turn. Finally, the judge's eyes turned toward me. Would the victim like to make a statement? Victim. The word echoed strangely in my head. Months ago, I might have flinched at it, but now I knew the truth. I wasn't just a victim. I was the survivor, the rebuilder, the one who had risen while they crumbled. I stood, straightening my jacket, and walked to the front. The silence was absolute. I looked directly at Gerald, then at the judge, then at the room filled with the town that had watched this battle unfold. You thought fire would silence me. I began, my voice steady. But fire doesn't erase the truth. It reveals it. It shows what's strong enough to endure and what crumbles into ash. I gestured toward Gerald and his cronies. They didn't just burn cabins. They burned themselves. Their greed, their arrogance, their cruelty. It's all here, exposed for everyone to see. They thought they could destroy me with flames. But flames can't kill what's real. They only burned away their own lies. I paused, letting the silence linger. Some people in the back nodded. Others clenched fists, remembering their own battles with the HOA. I rebuilt, I said finally, stronger. And I didn't just rebuild for myself. I built a sanctuary for this town, a place free of their rules, free of their chokehold, a place where people can live and breathe without fear of fines or threats. I leaned closer to the microphone, and I want the record to show this. They thought they held power. But real power isn't in rules or money or titles. Real power is in building something worth protecting. And no fire, no fraud, no HOA can ever take that away again. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. It was the silence of words sinking deep. Even the judge seemed moved. She nodded once before signaling me to return to my seat. Sentencing. The judge's gavel struck wood, and her voice was clear, unshaking. For the crimes of arson, fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement, this court sentences Gerald Kavanaugh to 35 years in federal prison. Leonard Briggs, 20 years. Other members of the Lakeshore Homeowners Association, terms ranging from 10 to 15 years. She leaned forward. There will be no parole. A collective breath swept through the courtroom. Justice had been spoken. Gerald slumped, the fight draining out of him completely. His face went pale, his lips trembling as the guards moved in to escort him away. For the first time, I saw him not as an enemy, not even as a man. Just a husk of pride burned to ash. He looked at me one last time as he was led past. His mouth opened, as if to say something. But nothing came, only silence. Aftermath. When I stepped outside, the sun was waiting. Warm, golden, alive. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. Months ago, I had stood in ashes, wondering if I had lost everything. Now, I stood with more than I ever had. My new resort was already open. Families were arriving, laughter spilling from fresh-built cabins, children splashing in the lake that reflected the clear sky. Tourists walked trails that cut through the woods, unbothered by the invisible chains the HOA once held. The cabins weren't just buildings. They were symbols. Proof that ashes don't stay ashes forever. Proof that you can rise higher, stronger, brighter from what tried to consume you. I opened my eyes, sunlight spilling across the courthouse steps. The HOA had tried to erase me with fire, but in the end, they had burned themselves out, and I had rebuilt on their ruin.